is how we can try to represent what you were saying. These are things we can't. So it was back and forth. So in the end, we ended up creating a risk scoring. It goes from 0 to 100. And I think Emily is going to talk about, it's a ranking, just Scott mentioned that they're considering. So we created a risk scoring for the 5,000 communities where we identified there were homes on their own wells. And then we also looked at over 4,000 small water systems, but that was a separate analysis with some of these similar concepts. And and as Greg also talked about this morning, this is our kind of stage 1 or 1.0 of this whole process and scoring and index development, because it will be improved over time, especially with input even from you all and as the state board continues to advance their work. So to capture scoring for households, we had to do this looking at groups of households or communities. So because of course, confidentiality issues. So we use census block groups as our unit of analysis. And this is something that Scott brought up, and this is something that we grappled with, and you do every time you do a risk or vulnerability assessment of what is the unit that we're going to use of spatial analysis. And so we use this to represent a community of households who are on their own supplies. And I can talk about that whole definer if anybody has a question about it. But the census block groups, for those of you unfamiliar with these, they have a few hundred households. They range from 600 to 3,000 people. The map here shows block groups. This is in Sacramento County, highlighted in either dark gray to red. And you can see that some are very small and others are quite large. The larger ones tend to be more rural, whereas the small block groups are where population density is higher. So why did we choose this unit of analysis? And it's going to be different from the aquifer risk part of the assessment that the board is working on. First, it avoids the confidentiality of the specific households, but it also allows the use of demographic population characteristics to be included from census estimates. And that was really important for our vulnerability part of our analysis. So we're going to walk through a few indicators we use to calculate risk. So this first one's already up here. We include 3 measures of climate change, and we use projections for mid-century. So it tells us some of the trajectory that the communities are exposed to of conditions. So where will conditions change that put communities at increasing risk to water shortage and drought? So these 3 are temperature shift and wildfire in terms of acreage burned, the projections of it, and the sea level rise into coastal aquifers. And that sea level rise is one of the only ones that's binary. Either there were presence of projected saltwater into coastal aquifers, or there wasn't. And so we used, but the other ones, temperature shift and wildfire, was a scalar metric. And if we get into those technical details, I'm happy to explain a little bit more about that. Let's see. It looks like my control might have been taken away. There we go. Okay, and this slide is just to show you that each of these data sets comes from a statewide spatial data set, and each indicator varies in terms of how much they contribute to risk. So, but as I was mentioning, the sea level rise into coastal aquifers that you see here on the right-hand side, it's not scalar. It's either there or it's not, because that's the best data that is available right now on this topic. So The second component, and we just have two components of this exposure I'm trying to introduce, is is the exposure to environmental conditions and events. And that's the current conditions. So to represent this, we looked at a number of things. So in terms of, we looked at current wildfire risk. This is from CAL FIRE, and it is different than the map of the climate change projections. We have developed and are kind of in also continuing development of an annual local drought forecast that would be relevant to those on their own supplies, they get their water locally. We also included the geology that affects reliability of well water, looking at fractured rock areas. And that, again, that one is another binary example of a metric. Then we looked at what areas have surrounding, we also looked at, we have a water quality risk score, and we worked with the Department or the Division of Water Quality, so Scott and Emily here today, to develop that, and that was great. And I'm sure that it will change over time too as their work advances. And but it simplifies what they've done into a single score. And then we have population growth, because as population grows in surrounding areas, it could indicate or signify as a proxy for potential increasing demand for water, which could put you at higher risk to, during dry periods or some other water shortage event. Then we used information that had been collected from the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act process. And so for the basin prioritizations, and this included presence of basin subsidence, salt presence, areas that were critically overdrafted, were in chronic decline for their groundwater levels, and then had surrounding irrigated agriculture. So we used those 5, and this is where it gets a little messy, and I didn't make a nice graphic for it, but among the basin conditions, we chose that as kind of a single indicator. We wrapped all those up as one. And so if you have any one of those things as a problem, then your area got marked as whatever the score of the highest problematic basin condition was. So then this is just, again, to be clear that these indicators and their data sets come from statewide spatial data that vary in terms of how much they contribute to risk. And the exception of the statewide data are the basin information we used, and that's only from alluvial basins that have been analyzed by the state in a pretty big, rigorous process that was recently conducted. Okay, and then this one, I know it's hard to see if you don't have a large screen, and we have public documents about this, but each of these risk factors was normalized to a 0 to 1 scale. And here I wanted to show that we have all of them, because we combined everything together, the exposure, vulnerability, and then we have a shortage indicator, but exposure was one piece of our risk score in the end. And we ended up weighting these different subcomponents in different ways. But initially, each of the indicators they were all normalized 0 to 1. Some were scalar, meaning they could be 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, up to 1. And others were more ordinal, where it would be, they could have 3 levels of significance, and others are binary. But we wrapped up, aggregated them together, and then the group decided that climate change should be reduced in terms of how much it's weighted. So it wouldn't be equally weighted with the current events and conditions because it is future and there is, it's gives it a not lesser importance, but we didn't want that to drive the whole story of risk. And so, and then this side of vulnerability and observed shortage is more related to the households and the information we have on wells. And then lastly, we have, if you would like to know more details about this, how the indicators are constructed, what data is used, we have an appendix 2 of the report that was just released, and it's on our website that I'll list at the end. And it is being proposed to be updated annually, this whole risk score, just as Scott said, that is proposed, or not, that's theirs is in law already, if that it will be updated annually. And this is our first iteration. But right now, so we have a tool that you can see the score for any location in California that has any domestic wells, and then it will show you kind of how each of the indicators played a role in contributing to that score for any given area. And then lastly, can move up here. See if it will advance. Okay. Lastly, and I've noted that we have a similar analysis that was conducted for small water suppliers, and it has almost the same exposure risk metrics, but it's very different in terms of the vulnerability indicators because those were specific to water systems. And that's also released publicly this week. So if anybody's interested in more information about that. And so this is our program's email address if you have follow-up questions or comments. And thank you for letting me participate today. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks again. I know that we're trying to catch up on time there, and there's a lot to cover in these presentations, so thank all of our presenters for kind of moving through this quickly. The slides were sent out this morning. If any participant on the line didn't get a copy of them, please email us at thesafer@waterboards.ca.gov. We'll make sure you get a copy of the slides. And thanks again, Julie, for that presentation. So now, we're going to ask for Claire to, so I'm going to introduce Claire from the Water Equity Science Shop at UC Berkeley. And Claire, I believe the screen is yours and you should have mic control.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. This is Claire Pace from the UC Berkeley Water Equity Science Shop, and I'll be presenting our work today identifying domestic well communities. I'm also going to show you how the data layer fits into the new drinking water tool that we developed, and this was a partnership with Community Water Center. And I'll also ask for your feedback on how our data could be incorporated into the aquifer risk map. No, that's not what I meant to do. Excuse me. Let's see. Okay, the Water Equity Science Shop. We're a community academic partnership, and we conduct research on the health risks associated with drinking water contamination in California. And from a big picture standpoint, we support community organizations, research, and policy using a community-based participatory research approach. We collaborate with San Francisco State University, Cal EPA's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHA, and the Community Water Center. And for anybody who's not familiar with them, the Community Water Center is a nonprofit advocacy group, and they work closely with grassroots organizations in communities, and they support access to clean and affordable drinking water. So we're really pleased to be partnered with CWC because it gives us an exciting opportunity for research translation, where we can address concerns about water issues that come directly from the community through our partners at CWC. So our research efforts facilitate the translation of concerns identified by the community into usable products for community members, researchers, and those implementing policy. The WESS is co-led by Dr. Rachel Morello-Frosch from UC Berkeley, Dr. Carolina Balas from OEHA, and Dr. Lara Cushing from San Francisco State University, and I'm a postdoc at UC Berkeley. We developed this project with Adriana Renteria, who was part of CWC and has since moved on to the Water Board as the director of the Office of Public Participation. Also with Amanda Fensel from CWC and hydrogeologist Rob Gailey. The WESS is funded under NIEHS Superfund program, and our first major project is to develop a data layer identifying the location of domestic well communities. The purpose is to support California's human right to water law by filling data gaps. And I want to mention that California has an excellent tool called the Tracking California Water Systems Service Area tool that identifies areas served by public water systems. However, as we've heard several times today, small water systems with 5 to 14 service connections and areas served by domestic wells haven't been fully mapped, and their water quality isn't monitored or regulated. So our goal was to collect and integrate the best statewide data that's currently available and to estimate the location and water quality for domestic well areas. Our domestic well communities project also fit really nicely into a project that CWC was leading. They had envisioned a drinking water tool that would pull together data in one centralized location and that users could access, where users could access data on water source, water quality, and drought risk. So on the right, I've listed the main data layers that make up the drinking water tool. And the WESS took the lead on the 3 layers in the red box. Each of these layers was generated from a variety of underlying data sources. And I'm going to walk you through the way that we created the domestic well communities layer. And we hope that this will also be a useful layer in developing the aquifer risk map. So there were 4 main data sources that we integrated into this layer. We used census block groups, community water system boundaries, point data for well locations, and polygon data locating residential parcels. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about how we put these together. So again, our goal was to define the boundaries of areas served by domestic wells because they hadn't been mapped. So to do this, we started with US Census data. We selected populated census blocks, and we excluded blocks with no population at the time of the 2010 census. Next, we took a curated list of boundaries from the Tracking California Water System Service Areas tool that defines the areas in California that are served by a community water system. And in order to integrate these first 2 layers, we spatially combined them, and we subtracted the areas that were served by a community water system from the populated census blocks. And this left the populated areas outside of water system boundaries that could potentially be served by a domestic well. Next, we brought in data from the Online System for Well Completion Reports, or OSCR. And the OSCR data set has point data for wells in California that were drilled over the last 50+ years. And the limitation is that most of this data is located at the centroid of a public land survey system section, which is a 1x1 mile grid square. And so again, we're dealing with integrating a new spatial geography. And in order to incorporate this layer with the previous 2, we took those 1x1 mile sections as the new geographical unit, and we distributed population estimates from census blocks to those sections by areal apportionment. And that's a method that assumes people are evenly distributed in the census block, and then it reassigns them to the section based on the amount of spatial overlap between those 2 geographical units. But in reality, a lot of the areas served by domestic wells are rural, and they're from relatively large census blocks with a relatively small population. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty about where people actually live within the census block. And to deal with this, and get a better sense of where people actually live and use a well, we also incorporated data on residential parcels in California. So this was polygon data that we intersected with that section data. And then we defined likely domestic well areas based on those 4 sets of included data. So we defined domestic well areas as sections that were populated, not served by a community water system, contained at least 1 domestic well, and intersected with at least 1 residential parcel. This shows our statewide results for water type. We estimate that about 35 million people are served by a community water system, and 1.6 to 2.1 million people are served by a state small or private domestic well. And as a reality check, these are numbers that are pretty consistent with USGS estimates and other research estimates of California's so-called self-supplied population. And those estimates range from about 1 million to 2.5 million. This is an example of the statewide water quality results. So I didn't describe our methodology for estimating water quality, and I'll just briefly say that we used existing water quality estimates that were developed by OWEHA for their CalEnviroscreen tool, and estimates that were developed by Sacramento State for their groundwater risk index tool. And we integrated these into our geography. So these are results for arsenic on the left and nitrite on the right. And I'm showing you the median and interquartile range in the box plots, as well as a 95th percentile value in the error bars. And the horizontal red line represents the maximum contaminant level, or MCL. And I'm displaying each contaminant by water system type, either a domestic well or by community water systems, which were stratified by size. Here I'm showing you regional results for the San Joaquin Valley, where our data suggests that over 487,000 people rely on a domestic well. Over 33,000 domestic well users live in areas where the source water may exceed the MCL for nitrate. And over 46,000 domestic well users live in areas where the source water may exceed the MCL for arsenic. So I would encourage you to experiment with the drinking water tool, where you can look up water quality and drought risk at a specific address by using the Your Water portal on the left. Or you can access statewide maps, data, and resources by using the California Water Data portal on the right. And I want to highlight just a few strengths and limitations of the domestic well communities layer. As for the strengths, this work is the product of multiple organizations working together in a community-driven research translation effort. And through this effort, we've created the first statewide publicly available source of data on domestic well communities. We've refined our estimates using parcel data, and we hope that this will create a basis for future research to protect vulnerable households. We also want to acknowledge several important limitations. For example, we're lacking information about state small water systems, and that's state data that would vastly improve our understanding of water use among these populations, which are outside of the service area of community water systems. We're also uncertain about the exact location of domestic wells, though we've done our best to fill in these data gaps by incorporating additional data sources, such as the parcel data. We also make some assumptions in our models. For example, we assume that populations are evenly distributed in census blocks, even though this is pretty unlikely in large rural census blocks. And finally, we believe that our method is a bit of an underestimate of reliance on domestic wells because we're excluding wells that are within the boundaries of the community water system. And with respect to that last point, I just want to mention that we created a separate data layer that contains point data for all domestic wells in California, which is from a curated list of domestic wells in the Oscar system. And so this layer is also available for download on the drinking water tool. And in other words, you can download either the data set for all domestic wells in California or our estimates of areas where we're most confident that the wells are being used. And we made both of these layers because they seem to, they answer different research questions. And so therefore they're different. They're useful for different purposes. In terms of next steps for the domestic well layer in particular, the WESS is working on an environmental justice analysis of drinking water quality by water source type. We'll be further refining the population estimates for domestic well communities. And we plan to fold in improved water quality data. We're also really excited about the possibility of this layer being used to inform the aquifer risk map. And we're enthusiastic to play a supportive role as plans develop. So with that, I want to take a little bit of time to receive feedback. So we're thinking about ways that the domestic well layer could be useful in developing this aquifer risk map. And in particular, how the domestic well layer can be used to define aquifer risk. So I'm going to put up a poll question that asks for feedback on what you feel are the most important factors of domestic well use related to aquifer risk. Are you viewing the, oops, hold on, view options? So I'm going to leave this up for about a minute. So I'm just going to leave this up for about another 10 seconds. Okay, thanks so much for your feedback. It looks like the majority of people feel that both the number of domestic wells drawing from an aquifer and the estimated population reliant on wells that are drawing from an aquifer are both pretty equally important. That's really useful information. Okay, so I also want to mention that if you have more specific thoughts or ideas on how to use the domestic well layer to define aquifer risk, we'd welcome that feedback through the email address safer@waterboards.ca.gov. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to present. I've also provided links to the drinking water tool and to a webinar that was hosted by Community Water Center that explains the tool in greater detail. Also a link to our white paper and contact information. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Claire, for that. And again, thanks to the presenters who are doing a good job of getting through their presentation content. And we are actually on time. So I'm going to introduce Emily now from the State Water Board's Division of Water Quality Gamma Unit. She's going to bring us home for this afternoon's sessions. Emily, the mic and the screen should be yours. Can you also remind us what Gamma stands for?
Thanks, Amanda. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. So as Amanda said, my name is Emily Houlihan. I'm in the Gamma unit, which stands for Groundwater Ambient Monitoring and Assessment in the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Boards. Today, I'm going to be talking about Gamma's efforts to estimate domestic well water quality in support of phase 2 of the needs assessment, and also how this work can give us a head start on creating the aquifer risk map. So I don't think I can forward the screen. I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. I see it now. So before I start talking about the work that we did in support of the needs assessment, I'd just like to briefly go over the existing water quality resources available for estimating domestic well water quality. The first data source is domestic well water quality results themselves, and I would also include state small results in this data set. This is obviously ideal in terms of accuracy. However, these data sets for both domestic wells and state small systems are generally limited in time and space, and there's currently no existing data set of water quality records from these types of systems that covers the entire state. The other option is to rely on modeling and estimation of shallow aquifer water quality. However, due to limitations in the modeling or estimation process, these data may not always represent the water quality that's actually accessed by domestic wells or state small systems. I'm sorry, Amanda, I don't think, oh. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you, sorry. This table just goes into a bit more detail what I just covered. It highlights some of the available raw water quality data sets that might be able to be used to estimate water quality, and also a sampling of a couple available models or estimations. I know that's not exhaustive. And it also highlights some of the limits that these data sets come with. So now I'm going to talk about the work that we did to estimate domestic well water quality as part of the needs assessment. You just heard a great presentation from Claire on more precisely identifying domestic well communities. So I'm not going to talk about that aspect, but I'm instead going to focus on the work that we did to basically filter a wide suite of existing raw water quality data to focus that data on water quality accessed by domestic wells. So I'm going to highlight a few key methodology decisions that informed our work. And if you're interested in any more details about this, we also wrote a white paper that goes into much greater detail about all of these decisions and all of the data sets and decisions that were made in this process. The first key decision that we made was to use a depth filter, and this allowed us to include more data than just domestic well records. As has been alluded to many times during this day, there is no existing complete data set of domestic well water quality or state small system water quality. And so we wanted to leverage the much larger public supply water quality data set in this estimation. But to do that, we had to only take data from public supply wells that were at a depth that public wells were also accessing. One of the second decisions we made, oh, sorry, I'm going to just highlight them first. Sorry, Amanda. We also used a square mile grid section, the public land survey system, to expand water quality averages outside of well points. In tandem with this, we used an area of analysis called groundwater units, which even further expanded this estimation. I'll explain that in a bit. And finally, we combined multiple metrics of water quality into a final water quality ranking system. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about our depth filter. This depth filter was based on well construction statistics for both public and domestic wells in California. We did a couple things with this depth filter. First, because well depths vary across the state of California, we localized our analysis to groundwater units, and I'll explain those in a bit, but you can see them outlined on the map there to the right. So for each groundwater unit in California, we identified a domestic well depth interval that represented the potential range of depths accessed by domestic wells in that area. Additionally, we combined we compared public and domestic well depths to see if public wells were accessing similar depths as domestic wells. The results of that analysis are shown on the map to the right, and you can see that in areas where public and domestic wells were accessing similar depths, we were able to leverage the public supply water quality data in those areas and get a better estimation of water quality. So in order to expand water quality from well points into a larger area, we used a tiered averaging system that prioritized the nearest available data from wells with water quality data. I've shown those 4 tiers here. The first tier is source sections, which are square mile sections that contain water quality data. The next tier is neighbor sections, which are sections that are adjacent to sections with water quality data. And the last tier is groundwater units, which are within a groundwater unit with water quality data, but more than 2 miles away from a well with water quality data. The final category is sections that are in a groundwater unit with no water quality data. We just assigned these unknown water quality, but this represents a very small percentage of areas in California. We were able to, by using the depth filter and public supply water quality data that was filtered, we were able to cover much of California with water quality estimations. Could you go to the next slide, please, Amanda? Thank you. So I've been referencing groundwater units several times during this presentation, and I realize that might be a new concept for many people. Groundwater units are a USGS delineated boundary that not only outlines basins of the state, but also includes upland portions. It was important to us to use this area of analysis instead of just basins, because we really wanted to estimate domestic well water quality for the entire state of California, not just traditional aquifers in basins. Using the unit of analysis of groundwater units to expand our averages allowed us to cover 99% of domestic wells with water quality estimations. One of the final key decisions we made was combining 2 different metrics of water quality analysis into a final grade. We combined both a 20-year average, which was calculated as I just described, with all results in a section within the past 2 years to assign a final water quality grade for sections. Here I should just note that we went through this process for all constituents with a maximum contaminant level, which plus hexavalent chromium, which came to about 96 constituents. The combination of the long-term average and recent results resulted in 7 different possible grades. And for the purposes of the needs assessment, grades of 4, 5, and 6 were flagged as potentially at risk. And you can see that this encompasses all sections that either had a long-term average and or any recent results above the maximum contaminant level, which was the threshold we used to assess for the needs assessment. All of these results are available for public use. We have a great ArcGIS tool that allows users to identify our shallow aquifer water quality estimations in all of California. This is just a screenshot showing nitrate estimations in the Southern Central Valley. And the nitrate estimations are shown in the color. And then on top of it, we've also overlain the Oscar estimates of domestic well counts per section. So you can see that by combining these 2 metrics, you can get an idea for where the most domestic wells could be at risk for water quality issues. This tool is available through our Gamma online tools page, which I believe is linked in the presentation, but can also be found on our website. As far as the results from this needs assessment, our study indicates that about 1/4 of domestic wells may have water quality risks from 1 or more of these constituents with an MCL that we analyzed. Additionally, 80% of all water quality grades above 4, which again is what we defined as at risk here, could be explained by 4 constituents, which was arsenic, trichloropropane, nitrate, and radioactive elements. Some of the other constituents only accounted for a very small percentage of domestic well risk, and so I've grouped them all in the bar on the right. So that concludes my presentation on the needs assessment portion of this study, and I'd like to slightly transition into thinking back to the aquifer risk map. Thank you, Amanda. Right now, I'd like to present this poll question to see what factors people think are the most important for assessing the risk of any aquifer for water quality. So we'll leave this up for about a minute, just like the others. So it looks like the clear winner with 61% of the vote was that all factors are equally important. Thank you very much for your input. So I'd also just like to remind people that if you have any immediate questions about this webinar or would like to ask a question about anything you've seen today, you can email the safer@waterboards.ca.gov email. And again, we're really at the very beginning process of developing this aquifer risk map. And I hope that the presentations today have sparked some good ideas about any feedback or suggestions or comments that people have. We really welcome all of that feedback as we start to think about how we might create this aquifer risk map. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to hand the control back over to Amanda. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily, and apologies for that remote control failure. I'm not sure why you couldn't maintain that, but thanks for working that out with us. And thank you to all of our speakers in session 1 and in session 2. We're going to move into the question and comment period of the webinar. We do have some questions coming in. If you would like to ask a question or comment, please email safer@waterboards.ca.gov with the subject at-risk webinar, your name, organization or affiliation, and the topic of your question or sentence that you would like to comment on. So we're trying to take them in order as best as we can, just as if this was a live meeting. So we did have a question come in from Jonathan from the California Municipal Utilities Association, who thinks that maybe Julie could answer this question. Many retail water systems and wholesale water agencies have remote facilities that may have their own water systems who have incredible technical, managerial, and financial capabilities, and who are more than likely to have contingency plans if those small systems run out of water. Does the tool you talked about take that into account?
Hi, Jonathan. At this point, no, but so as of now, the tool takes into account if the system itself, the focus, and so my talk wasn't supposed to really be about the systems, but for the systems analysis, it takes into account if they have a contingency plan for water shortage or a drought preparedness plan, if they reported that to the electronic annual drinking water survey to the board. But that's an interesting idea that you raise. And at this point, this was our first iteration of the scoring. So the risk scores don't reflect the capacity or other aspects of, or the other TMF capacities of their wholesalers, to the small water suppliers. A lot of them don't always have direct wholesalers, but they may have interties or close by systems. And that would be a really interesting exercise to see if we could come up with some indicators that connect either by spatial proximity or by actual connections that they have. So that's something that we could explore to possibly include in the future and say a few next iteration of this risk scoring. So I'm going to put a pin in it and save your question so we can talk about that in the future. Thank you for that idea.
Thanks, Julie. The next question is for Claire, and it's from Castulo in Coachella Valley Water District. Does the drinking water tool assume that all communities within the boundaries of a community water system are served by the community water system? For example, the Coachella Valley Water District has a boundary that covers most of the Indio Subbasin, a service area of about 1,000 square miles, but about 50% of that boundary is made up of agriculture and lacks potable water infrastructure, and a consequence of this is where we have a high concentration of state smalls and domestic wells that supply the communities established in this area. That was for Claire.
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to first say thank you for that question. The boundaries that we're currently using are from the Tracking California Boundary Tool, which is an interactive tool. So users are able to go in and adjust the boundaries based on their own local knowledge. So my recommendation would be for people to use that tool and to go ahead and adjust those boundaries and update those with information, because we're trying to remain consistent and use the publicly available state data as sort of one of our policies. And given that, we also like to do some ground truthing to look at areas just like the one you're talking about. So thanks for your comment. And at the moment, we are, yes, just using the boundaries that are officially reported through the drinking water tool, the former drinking water tool.
Thanks, Claire. Why don't you stay unmuted, because the next question is for you and Emily, and it's coming from Laura from the Pacific Institute. And her question is that the methods used by WESS and GAMA to identify the number and location of domestic wells are similar but divergent in some regards. For example, WESS included records of domestic wells within the boundaries of community water system service areas, whereas GAMA included them. Can Claire and Emily comment on the differences in their methodology, the significance of the differences, and how future researchers should reconcile their results? Thanks.
So that's a really good point. And what WESS tried to do was to use just water systems that we can more confidently say we're sure are being used. But given that, we also know that some wells are used, which are within community water system boundaries. So we also provide that data in the drinking water tool. And really, which data set you want to use will depend on your research question. As I know, I'm sure Emily can speak to this more specifically, but in their project, it's probably possibly more important to overestimate the number of domestic wells. Whereas in the research project that I was working on, it seemed more realistic to get a conservative estimate of who uses a domestic well in assessing how many people are at risk of using water that's contaminated based on domestic well use. Emily, do you want to add to that?
That was exactly what I would say. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both for that. This next question is for Scott and maybe Emily. Are there any estimates of the number of domestic wells that don't have well logs or aren't on GAMA? From my experience, those would be at even more risk or more vulnerable because they are probably older wells.
Sure, I can go ahead and take this, Scott. So one way that we have to ground truth that, we understand that the OSCAR data set is not perfect, but USGS is in the process of and has been doing some more extensive studies on the location of domestic wells. And so one possible avenue for that is to compare in a small test area the wells that USGS has identified as domestic and wells that are on OSCAR to get a sense of what any error percentage might be, and then expand that into other areas of the state. Feel free to add on, Scott.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and we would love to dive deeper later on, but we understood from the Oscar data that we realized the inaccuracies in that data set, but we were under the general impression that the errors in that set are not systematic in either direction. You can look at it and say it underestimates the number of domestic wells because they were poorly classified. But then you could say, yes, but it includes a lot of older wells that may not be operating on the other side. So every time we looked at a deficiency in the Oscar data, it seemed to cut both ways. But we're definitely wide open on learning more about that. And like Emily said, getting high quality data sets also in Region 3 in San Luis Obispo County, and maybe doing a systematic comparison of an Oscar data set and a more focused one, and see if we can learn from that to get to your question.
Great. Thanks for that. Another question is for Emily, possibly. This is coming from Jeff at Chevron North America Exploration and Production Company. Will the owners or operators of small public water systems and/or domestic groundwater wells have an opportunity to review assessment results as well as the data quality of the assessment inputs?
That's a good question. So absolutely. One of the major things that we're really trying to emphasize in this is the data transparency. A good example for what we've already done that you can access the sort of metadata behind it is the white paper that accompanied our estimations for the needs assessment. But in all the future things we do with the Aquifer Risk Map, we're going to be definitely sure to use only publicly accessible data and to be very transparent about both the data sets we use, anything we do to them, and our exact methodology in assessing risk. So definitely.
Thanks for that. And their next question is for John. How is the Water Board going to address at-risk rural domestic wells that are in the white zones outside of SGMA's scope?
Right. Hey, this is John. So I wanted to once again thank everybody for participating today. These have all been great presentations, and like I mentioned at the outset, there were a lot of questions we got beforehand, and I believe this is one of those questions. And I just want to encourage people after, if they think of something that they'd like to ask, to send an email to the SAFER email address, and we'd be happy to follow up with you on any questions you may have about this kickoff meeting we've had today. And I'm really appreciative of all the input we've received and the great presentations. I think the way I'd like to answer that question, though, regarding SGMA, is that that's part of the reason why we're here today, is to look at all of the potential ways in which we could unpack what an at-risk aquifer is. And so input like that with respect to keeping in mind, elements from SGMA and so forth, even though there's not it's not written into the legislation that we need to do that, but obviously we're looking at means of being able to identify what an at-risk area is. And so I would like to actually take a step back and weigh in a little bit on the question that was asked about Emily's efforts for looking at the needs assessment elements. The district boundaries for water districts are take into account areas that may exclude areas where there are domestic well users that are within those boundaries. So the method that was used for the gamma needs assessment errs on the side of those folks that may have a domestic well that it falls within the boundary of a water district. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And also I'd like to point out that in the early 2000s, the USGS wrote a framework report for the gamma program. And in it, there's an analysis of how you could identify prioritization of where there are groundwater resources that are being used. And I'd invite folks to take another look at that, because I think it was somewhat insightful, and it has been used to that particular framework has been used to build the framework for Sigma and other efforts across the state. So it's one aspect of it is that where there are people, there's going to be people that need water, and oftentimes where there are people where they need water, there's going to be a well associated with that area. Obviously, there are areas where there is less population, where people are reliant on well water, but there are several ways to identify prioritizing areas where groundwater could be used for one way in one way or another. So I would invite folks to take a look at that report, and it's accessible by going to our GAMA website, and we'd be happy to share that link with folks if they're interested in looking at that report.
Thanks for that and for answering and clarifying that question from earlier. We have a question that's for Emily, and this is from Maj. Does the GAMA domestic well water quality tool show the number of people relying on each domestic well, or at least predict the number of people affected by potential drought for any well?
Thanks for that question. So we do not estimate the number of people in each section reliant on domestic well. Right now, the tool only shows an estimate of the number of wells per section. You can multiply that by approximately 2.5 or 3 to get an idea of the number of people that might be affected. And to answer the second part of that question, right now, no, our tool does not estimate people that might be affected by drought. For that, you would want to look to other tools such as the tool that Julie described earlier or others.
Great, thank you. This next question is for John, Scott, or Emily again. Will the State Water Board allow systems to submit additional data that could change their risk profiles? DWR is currently accepting additional data in the beta version of the tool that Julie touched on, and OWEHA has indicated they would consider allowing systems to submit additional information in their human rights to water tool as well.
This is Scott.
Looks like Scott, yeah, Scott, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can address that. We definitely, yes. We are always seeking new data to help inform all the estimations that Emily's been talking about. We have in GAMA a data upload tool, a data connection tool that we have built to try to facilitate us importing data, water quality data into our system. And once it's in the system, then it's automatically incorporated in any updates. We're also starting the process per SB 200 to receive water quality data from state small systems from counties. And we frankly don't know quite what that's going to look like. Each county has different types and quantities and qualities of data. So we're just getting started on that project, but that's another avenue for direct water quality to get into the system. And so our tool accurately reflects it.
Great. Well, thank you for that. We don't have any more questions actually coming in for this session. So if anyone does have any more questions or comments that they'd like to add, you can email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov.
Amanda, this is Julie. Can I add on to the last question that Emily just answered?
Yes, of course. And it looks like we do have a couple more questions coming in right now, but please.
Oh, just real quick.
There's a little bit of a delay, so please add on to anything.
So the person asked about the number of wells within a given area that could be at risk from drought risk. And so I'm not sure if they were asking about what I was trying to present a little bit about. We have an estimate of domestic wells per area. So when you hover or click on within this interactive tool, it will pop up and show you the estimated number of domestic wells in that area that we have as a count, what proportion of the population would have, or proportion of the households in that area that have domestic wells. And I mean, there's also information about the number of tribal households in that area and some other information about related to socioeconomics and drought risk. So if they were interested more in that aspect, that's all.
Great. Thanks for that, Julie. And it looks like we actually don't have any more questions for this session. So if there aren't any more questions coming through, we can go ahead and close out. I'm just going to hang out here for a few more minutes just to see if we get anything on here, because sometimes there is a little bit of a delay and we don't want to cut anybody off. While we're double checking the emails are coming in, I do want to let everyone know that's on the call right now that you can go to the SAFER website for any information. And we actually, I believe we just launched a new SAFER website possibly today. So this is great timing. We're working through some things on that website as well as you go there, but we're trying to make the SAFER website much more friendly and resourceful place for folks that want to learn more information about this. So that's in development as well. So check that out. Also, please sign up for our question and answer webinar on April 30th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. The Eventbrite link is on your screen. It's safer-qa-session.eventbrite.com. You can also go to Eventbrite and search SAFER Q&A, and that'll come up. Right now, it looks like we are going to do it for 90 minutes, but given the content of this and some questions that we're getting about the SAFER program specifically, we're going to look into extending that to 2 hours. So that time might change. We did get a question that came in from Sue from Self-Help Enterprises. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Sue's questions. She says, could she get thoughts or approach for the sensitivity of domestic well users not wanting their info made public? So anybody want to talk about that?
Actually, I could answer that, Amanda. Great. So yeah, I thank you for that question. I think that's a really important question to ask with respect to respecting people's privacy. So that's one aspect of the development of this. For years, the information about the location of public water system wells on our Gamma system has evolved over the years, in large part due to the legislation that was passed a few years ago, where part and parcel with Oscar being rolled out by the department on the location of where wells are located is a matter of public record, but that the personal information associated with any of that is not. That's still protected. So the information, if you go to Oscar and you click on an area and look at the well logs, the well owner name and address is obscured. That information is protected. So we've applied a similar approach to the protection of people's privacy. So that's going to be maintained.
Thanks for taking that. And it looks like that's all the questions that we have. I do want to announce that there's going to be a follow-up webinar or hopefully an in-person meeting to this discussion today, and that's going to be held on June 16th. So watch out for information about that. We'll either be sending the links to register for the webinar, or hopefully we'll be sending invites to meet in person, possibly with some chairs distanced from each other if it is in person. Just want to thank everyone today. Thank you for the patience at the beginning as we were waiting to get linked to the Cal EPA webcast. We're going to go ahead and adjourn the webinar. And again, if you have any questions, please always email us at safer@waterboards.ca.gov. And the webinar recording will be available as soon as we can get it from our clouds to Cal EPA's, because we did record it from our side from the beginning. So we'll try to work on getting that up for everybody to look at it in case you missed something good. A big thank you to all of our presenters for your presentations, for working through this system, for answering questions. Thanks to the folks behind the scenes trying to make this webinar a success and effective use of everybody's time. And thank you to our participants for registering, joining us, and making this our largest webinar that we've ever done on Zoom. It's also our first one, so thanks. And that's it today. I'm gonna just adjourn now and ask everybody to stay safe and sanitize. All right, bye guys.